back to our podcast on Red Dead Redemption 2, History and Ethics. This week, we read chapters 13 and 14 in Schaefer Landau, and the first chapter being on the advantages of social contract theory, and the second chapter, or chapter 14, being the objections, problems, or disadvantages with the theory. We also read another chapter, chapter 5, from Richardson's West from Appomattox. If you're a graduate student, your reading this week is from Walter L. Hickson's American Settler Colonialism and Jeffrey Sayre McCord's Contractarianism, available on Blackboard or via email. So this week we're going to start a little different. I want to start by talking about contractarianism because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in social contract theory as a theory of morality. And then we will kind of go back and forth with the history and ethics through the rest of the podcast. So the first thing I want to note is, and if you did your reading, you probably noted this too, is that social contract theory or contractarianism, we'll use those terms interchangeably, it really starts out as a political theory, right? It really starts out as a theory of like, what would make a political system legitimate, in particular if I care about the consent of the governed, right? And so that's how social contract theory starts in Hobbes. There are Kantian versions of it. And of course, David Hume has a version of social contract theory. I think it is Rousseau who talks sort of about the state of nature and gives a kind of social contract theory. So there's different ways to think about it, but initially it starts as a political theory. And that political theory really, its contours really hinges on what you think the state of nature is like. And so when we say the state of nature, we usually mean, what would human life have been like even in the absence of, social rules and policies and big legal infrastructure and stuff, right? And Thomas Hobbes, who had the particular view of the state of nature, and I'm sure this, a lot of scholars now think this had to do with his upbringing and like the historical circumstances of his time, but he had a pretty negative view of human beings. He thought the state of nature is a war of all against all, that human life in the state of nature is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short, that basically, it would result in people taking as much as they can, getting as much as they can through violence, through anything they could. And even he thought, Hobbes even thought that's sort of advantageous to some people, but even really strong people, they got to sleep sometimes. You got to rely on others. And so even if you're really strong, someone could come in and knife you while you're sleeping at night, or right, an old lady could come in and have a gun and shoot you. And so it's really this kind of dangerous situation. If you think about post-apocalyptic fiction or even post-apocalyptic games like the Fallout games, that's kind of a theme, right? Is that everything is scary because everyone is out for their own, right? They're out to get other people, and they're really out just for themselves. It's a kind of egoistic view, right? And so for Hobbes, he thought that to escape that state of nature, and Hobbes was, his particular kind of social contract theory was actually a kind of, almost like a monarchical one. It's like absolute power in one ruler, which was the Leviathan, right? That's what we had to do. And the idea there is individuals are going to give up some of their power and freedoms from the state of nature so that others also give up those powers and freedoms so that things can be better for all of us, right? Now, if you have a different view of the state of nature, if you're a little more optimistic, like Rousseau and maybe Montesquieu and some others, you think that, maybe that civilization is the problem and cultures and big infrastructure is the problem because people would just naturally be giving to one another and loving to one another and supportive of one another. But it's this sort of civilizing influence that ruins them. And so those are very different views of the state of nature that lead to not only social contract theory, but kind of different permutations of it. So from a Hobbesian point of view, it's people really thinking about their self-interest and really thinking about, how much of my own self-interest should I give up for the benefit of others that is also kind of for my own safety and stuff, right? If you go back to an older philosophical point, this is a discussion that Glaucon and Socrates have about justice. And Glaucon basically says justice is kind of how people will agree to limit themselves because they can't do, everything they want to do. And so, the famous thing from that is the ring of Gyges, which is a ring you put on and it makes you invisible. And he thought, if people didn't have any accountability for their actions, no social censure, no chance of getting in prison, they would basically be evil, awful people, which again goes back to that state of nature of like, really, what are people like? What is human nature like, right? And so contract theory really goes from this is a political theory. And then, in the last couple hundred years, people kind of turn it and try to think of it as a moral theory. And there are different reasons for that. One of them, at least, has to do with also self-interest, navigating self-interest and kind of the demands of morality. And another one really has to do with the idea that, we often think morality should kind of be a social enterprise. People make it, right? And people create it, and people talk about it, and patterns of culture and individual actions are what bring it about. And so sometimes utilitarianism or Kantianism or other theories seem a little too far removed from the everyday human condition and from our social condition, right? And social contract theory really brings that social part back to us. It's what do we, when we navigate in terms of our disagreement, what can we all agree on that is necessary for the moral functioning of our community or for the broader political functioning of society? So I think that, keeping in mind that self-interest part is going to be relevant here, because that really leads to how we think about these historical occurrences and where they go. So
yeah, so it's interesting you bring up like the self-interest element of social contract theory, because you have for that chapter 5 in Richardson, working through after 1873 to 1880.
Yeah.
This again kind of focusing on that mainstream view and seeing. Right, in using kind of this, it's very Hobbesian, right? The idea that if things are let go, then labor and big business, and then also within this time, African Americans or newly emancipated people of African descent are special interests, and so they're going to disrupt.
Advantage.
They're going to take advantage. Because you see the world through that nasty, brutish, everyone's out to get someone else. And so self-interest somehow translates into we need to fight special interests.
Yeah.
Right?
That's very good, yeah.
And a part of that is, there's this clinging to this economic harmony, right?
Sure.
That vision of if there's economic harmony, and big business is going to disrupt it, or labor, or
these other special interests.
Yeah, the other special interests, and this begins to unfold in that panic of 1873.
Yeah.
Right, because there's speculation, railroad directors speculating.
Yeah.
I guess if you look at most of these panics and depressions, usually it's fueled by speculation. But
can you explain speculation in this context?
It's basically,
we're not just thinking about people thinking very generally.
Yeah, like a famous one is sort of the Florida property in the Great Depression, or anywhere, right? Think of, there's going to be, the Denver area is going to explode, and I own all this property, and you better get in on it. You need to buy this. Yeah. And so then people come in, take loans, buy all this property because they're speculating on the future that they'll be able to turn around and sell it for a higher price.
Yeah.
It's that 2007, 8, 9 crash.
The recession.
Right. There's a reason why you saw all these, like Vegas was really interesting to go to, right, in that time, because you had all these half-made buildings that looked like, something from a dystopian post-apocalyptic movie, because everything just stopped. Yeah. And so there's like cranes, but there's just a layer of dust over everything. And so, but the other part too is farmers, they increased their production so much that they were producing too much.
Yeah.
So the price of agricultural products went down. And then of course, employers, fire workers, cut wages, and then that, creates that perpetuation of, an economic downturn.
Yeah.
But we also have to remember too, this is just, you're barely, not even 20 years after the war, and wars always mess with the economy unless you're kind of paying attention to it. Arguably, after World War II, the economy that is in place looked at that specifically, and there's a reason why that 40s, 50s, 60s had that sort of economic expansion. But I think, especially, the state of nature, social contract theory, this is driving much of the discontent, right, at the time. I think the main one, sort of the final thing here is the Granger movement, where farmers are basically, in many ways, unionizing. Right, they're coming together as a conglomeration or as a decentralized entity. Right, they're all on their own, but they can pull together. Pool their grain into one spot. Co-ops or sort of.
And you go to just about any little town in Kansas, and one thing it's going to have is probably a co-op. I mean, even the littlest towns, ones that aren't even incorporated,
have the co-op, and then that's just to give you some weight in the market.
So I really liked the thing you mentioned about sort of thinking about like workers and companies firing workers and stuff, and it kind of makes me think of two things. The first being that phrase, what is the phrase, like penny wise and pound foolish, right? Where sometimes people want to cut things in the short term that will give you these financial incentives, but in the long term actually does more damage. And that makes me think about this other sort of thing that people talk about often in the context of social contract theory, which is the prisoner's dilemma. So I want to just mention that quickly. And this can be a way that we think about how, primarily focusing only on your own self-interest can actually lead to worse outcomes for everyone, right? And this is, I think, a key thing to think about in the context of social contract theory, because the idea is all these contractors coming together, they're going to give something up, but it's for these benefits. But of course, you might just ask, why can't I just do what's going to be best for me every time, right? So the prisoner's dilemma comes from game theory, which is a kind of extension of rational choice theory in economics and just some like computational modeling of outcomes. And the idea behind the prisoner's dilemma is roughly this. Let's say you and another person have committed a crime and the cops have you in different rooms. And let's suppose the cop comes in and tells you, look, here are the sort of three outcomes. If neither of you choose to confess, then I won't have enough proof to send you away for the big crime, but I got you on some stuff, so you're each going to do 5 years. If one of you confesses and the other doesn't, the confessor, because they've given us the information we need, will go free, and the person who doesn't confess is going to get 10 years. Now, if, on the other hand, both... Sorry, did I mess this up? Yeah, now if... What is it? Is it if both of you confess, you get... I'm so sorry. I was just thinking through this and kind of messing it up. So if both of you, that's right. So if both of you confess, you get...
reduced
what
sentence.
is it? It's like you each get a reduced sentence of, that's right. You each get a reduced sentence of 5 years. If neither of you confess, you each get a reduced sentence of 1 year. That's right. And if one confesses and the other doesn't, the one who didn't confess gets 10 years. The one who did confess gets nothing, right? So the difficult thing about the prisoner's dilemma is it is in game theory, you would say the strictly dominant strategy, the strategy that you can use to have the best income for you is to confess every time, right? So suppose the other person isn't going to confess. Well, if you confess, you go from spending a year in jail because neither of you confessed to 0. So that's better for you, right? And if the other person also confesses, well, if you don't confess, that's going to mean you're going to get 10 years. But if you do confess, you're going to get 5, right? Because you both confessed. So in each case, what's the thing you ought to do in terms of your own self-interest, strictly speaking, is to confess. But it turns out if neither of you just confessed, you would each serve 1 year. And so jointly, that's actually what's better for both of you, as opposed to what's likely to happen. You're both going to work this out. You're both going to confess. You're both going to get 5 years.
Yeah.
Right?
And then your self-interest kicks in.
Exactly. So that's the difficulty, right? Is that by following your self-interest in the prisoner's dilemma, you actually do worse off than if you didn't follow your own self-interest. And that's, I think, an interesting way to think about social contract theory is like, I don't want to just sort of, it's not supposed to be about making morality to serve me the best. But if I think about this sort of moral contract that we all have, we can all, even with our disagreements, agree on some ground set of moral rules, then that might make everything better for everyone, right? Yeah. And so one way to think about, I was just thinking about this in the context of these people that are laying off employees and stuff, is maybe they were thinking in my self-interest or in the interest of the business, this is necessary, but actually it might have turned out to be worse, right? Often it's kind of speculative, like real estate or other kinds of things, turns out to make things worse for just about everybody, or for lots of people anyway.
Yeah,
right?
No one's buying anything.
Yeah.
Well,
So,
the prisoner's dilemma. Just think of if you are going to talk.
Yeah.
Where's the code? The code of right.
Yeah.
The criminal
Your
code.
integrity or something.
Your integrity
Yeah.
is going to be attacked.
Yeah.
You're not going to be able to do future.
That's right.
In your industry of crime.
And that's exactly right.
You won't be able to work in that field.
That's right.
Let alone
you're going to be a rat
if you're connected to organized crime.
Oh yeah, real bad news.
You're better. Yeah, you're better off taking the year, and then hopefully that.
Yeah.
You get a raise.
Yeah. You just
better benefits.
Take care of your family while you're in the pen. Yeah.
Yeah. It's because it's funny because even the quote the code exists within a criminal world too, where there's certain things you don't do. That's right.
Yeah. So this is maybe even connecting back to that Kantian idea of like integrity. Sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes not, depending on what's guiding you. But even honor among thieves, right?
Yeah.
Even among people engaged in criminal activities, there's some expectation that you're not going to rat each other out.
Yeah, and within Dutch's gang,
that's right.
You see that operating. But remember that first chapter, was it Kieran?
Yeah, Kieran. Yeah.
Right, he gets your binoculars. You look at, he's getting yelled at.
Yeah,
and so if anything, was it Colm O'Driscoll?
Yeah, Colm O'Driscoll. Yeah,
like he is not treating his workers very well.
That's right.
And it turns out that one of them leaves.
Yeah,
gets captured, but eventually
becomes
a part of the other gang, and they have an easier time targeting.
The O'Driscolls because they have an inside person.
Yeah. And
there's also maybe, we don't want to spoil anything, but there's some other ways this might come back at the later part of the game too.
Yeah. So it is interesting as you go through the philosophy in it.
Yeah.
It rips through this game.
Absolutely. Yeah. It really, Red Dead Redemption 2, and there are other games that have done this too, but it really is, I think, quite a morally complex game. And so it's really, it's a great use case to think about testing and seeing all of these different ethical theories at play. So,
so the other thing I was going to talk about here, and this is the graduate reading, which is the Walter Hickson's American Settler Colonialism.
Yeah.
Settler colonialism as a concept is really.
Could you help us understand that?
Yeah, it comes about in the late 90s ish, but it also comes out of post-colonial studies, which is a very 60s, 70s, 80s trend in academia related to decolonization and that sort of thing.
Is this some of the Edward Said?
Yeah, Edward Said is sort of one of the top sort of.
And Fanon, right?
Fanon is the.
Fanon.
He's always considered one of the original,
without
meaning to be without meaning to be post-colonial.
He is
his works.
I see.
A lot of the works from the 30s, 40s, and 50s lay the basis. But it's not like they went out of their way to come out,
Sure.
Richard Wright is very much. His nonfiction is really interesting to read. I started reading his stuff a couple years ago, and it's like, I missed out on this years ago. But his work's really interesting. But settler colonialism is, everyone's heard of colonialism, and you basically have an idea of what colonialism is, right? It's just.
Bigger, more
sovereign government, sovereign nation goes in and takes over another area, takes over the people.
They become a colony.
And
it's power and has effects on not only their economy and resources, but culture, language. Those kind of things.
And sometimes you conscript labor, but settler colonialism is different because it involves moving into an area and. It involves families arriving too. And it involves turning the area not necessarily into a colony that you extract wealth from, but a colony that you make into a new homeland.
I see.
And that's the big difference
the people
for this new people that come to the colony
from the sovereign power.
Yeah, and so the idea, the famous quote is, the settler colonialism is a structure, not an event. Meaning, it's a structure of thinking. It's ongoing.
Yeah.
Right. We could say,
policy.
we could say that debates over, indigenous images as mascots is a part of this ongoing settler colonialism because, mascots create an image of, right, you've taken the image of the vanquished and now you're celebrating them.
That's commodified.
It's kind of commodified. But it comes from, most of the time from this sort of the dominant group that's in it. The other part too is, the settler, right? Because, for the most part, we don't grow up learning about, we learn about American settlers moving west.
Yeah.
You don't learn about American invaders moving west.
That's right. Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think we've talked a bit about this, but American Primeval.
Mm-hmm.
The second episode, the opening scene in the second episode is amazing because it shows all of this all at once.
Okay.
And it's just this sort of, Native Americans riding up to the massacre that took place in episode 1.
Yeah.
And then one of the guys on horseback says something. No spoilers.
Yeah.
But what he says is very... It's completely it's a commentary on settler colonialism.
Okay.
The other part too is there's a level of violence, but the violence is justified through sort of the defense of the family.
I see.
Right. Yeah. So you have, say, the cabin and the defense of women and children. If there's the cabin massacre, then that justifies, sort of get the posse together and you massacre the entire Native American village.
Yeah.
Right. And so you have this back and forth. A really good sort of test case of this is looking at the early colonial years.
Okay.
Right. So King Philip's War,
okay.
The 1700s.
Okay.
And the conflicts and sort of the language people use to describe like what exactly is going on.
Sure.
The other part is this idea of it being zero sum, right? And this is that, to me, this speaks to sort of this social contract.
Yeah.
Because in a very Hobbesian way of seeing the world.
Yeah.
I mean, this is as close to Hobbesian as you can get.
Sure.
You have to be nasty and brutish to create the homeland.
Yeah.
It has to be zero sum. So there has to be ethnic cleansing. There has to be massacres.
Yeah.
If the indigenous remain...
We can't or something.
Yeah, well, you can't call it a homeland.
Yeah.
Right? It's not a homeland if there's indigenous people.
Yeah.
And so it becomes this, this extremely violent, but then if you flip it inside out, it's this peaceful westward expansion.
Yeah.
Right? There's a positive...
American settlers going to untouched original land.
Yes. And so it's very poetic.
Yeah.
And to me that kind of gives you, it's sort of
like
America, the utopian paradise of new starts.
Yeah.
And then sort of you flip it inside out and it's built on this, ethnic cleansing and Indian removal, let alone the slavery part, right?
Sure.
And to me, that's, we're, when we think of this as a structure and not like an event,
a particular occurrence,
we still are arguing about this history today.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's, I mean, that's one of the reasons why I like the concept is it very much breathes.
Sure.
Right? It provokes in a way.
It's alive.
Yeah. What was the last part here? The other part, I guess, is this sort of paradigm of desire disgust.
Okay.
Right. And we see this in the game. We see this in a lot of Westerns. This pops up in American Primeval.
Okay.
But the desire disgust, and this was a problem during the early colonies. Right. So a lot of English people would arrive. If you have money and property and all that stuff, like you're doing okay, right? Like you're still dealing with colonial conditions, but If you arrive and you're an indentured servant, right, and you're just basically, being worked to death by the person who owns your contract.
Yeah.
If there is some way to escape and join a group of Native Americans,
Yeah.
and sort of be assimilated into their community,
Yeah.
that is a better life than the one of you toiling in a tobacco.
Yeah.
Right. And so early on, there's a problem with English colonials
kind of defecting
over to Native American groups because there was
the material conditions of their life were much better.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the hard work is rewarded.
Yeah.
Right. It's
not with this indenture.
Yeah, it's not alienated. You could work hard as an indentured servant, but it's all taken from you.
Yeah.
Because you're just doing time.
Yeah.
And so to me, there's a strange desire, disgust, because at the same time, the English would call Native Americans savages.
Yeah.
Right. Eventually, it becomes racialized. I think
sure.
We have to remember that it's a lot slower than, say, anti-blackness that's connected to slavery. Because even Jefferson was, he wrote about,
he's convinced that we would intermingle.
We would mingle with Native Americans and just become a new race.
Yeah.
Of Native Americans blended with Europeans, and that would be the American.
Yeah.
By the time you do get up to Red Dead 2, that is long gone.
That's right. Yeah.
You have the guy downtown, Saint Denis, that you can execute with the cop not doing anything.
He's the anti-miscegenation.
Yeah, he's the eugenics.
Yeah.
And so there is this desire, disgust. On the one hand, desiring the identity of the indigenous, right? Yeah. Which is freedom, which is almost a purer freedom than, say, within a colonial life. But then there's the disgust.
Yeah. And
we can see that in the mascot debates where there's a desire, disgust.
Sure.
Right.
Kind of binary.
If for the schools that have Indian mascots, do you learn everything you can learn about the groups that are in the area?
Yeah.
Or do you just keep the mascot because you desire that element? The other one is, like military weapons.
Yeah.
Right. Apache, Chinook, Tomahawk missiles. As a settler colonial nation, it appropriates these images because the images are very powerful.
Yeah. I think one thing that's interesting in this about just thinking in my own experience, basically just said, I went to a high school where our mascot was the Indians. It was just the Indians as a whole. It was not a particular, group or whatever, but that was our mascot. And of course, I'm an old man and I graduated a long time ago, so there weren't debates about this really happening very much, at least at that level when I was younger. But certainly I'm sure they've had more discussions about it, even in this very small town, right? And I don't remember. We learned a very small amount about the particular tribes that would have been in our area, but it was pretty minimal. So we did not learn a great deal about those individuals, even though the reason to have them as a mascot in a lot of people's language would have been to honor them or as an admirable thing or something. So that is really interesting. So kind of coming back around to our social contract theory, I guess I want to think about at least 2 to 3 more kind of things, and I'll try to be quick about about those two. But let me know if you have thoughts or questions or how this might apply. So one thing I want to think about, when you probably read the chapter on social contract theory, you thought, does anything go? Can I agree to anything, right? If this group puts together any rules, does that automatically mean they're right? This kind of is related. We didn't talk about this in this course, but this kind of related to what for divine command theory was called the Euthyphro problem. So the idea was, does God command us to do what is right because it's right, or is it right because God commands us to do it? And you can think about this similar problem for social contract theory, right? Are the deliverances of morality from the social contractors and the agreements they make, is it right for some reason about consequences or duty serving or other reasons for goodness, or is it just whatever the contractors say kind of goes? Because you might worry in the same way that people worry about this in divine command theory, that, well, if it's just whatever they decide has to be by definition right, then it's going to be arbitrary, also could be deeply immoral. There's all these kind of possibilities, right? And that doesn't look like a good foundation for your ethical theory. So I think a way to think about this, and this is the way like contemporary people who work on social contract theory and the meta-ethics think of it, is it isn't just anything goes. You could have this view of kind of like, what you might call moral or cultural relativism, where it's like, if a society says this is what the right thing and wrong things are to do, then that is what it is, right? It's just entirely determined by what those social mores are. And that is not what's supposed to be the case for social contract theory. And part of the way they get around this is they think the contractors would, in some way, there's different stories about this, but they have to be kind of idealized versions of the deciders. So they have to be people who are adhering to rationality, that even other people who might disagree with a specific point they're making would see how there are reasons to accept it. And so that kind of objectivity in social contract theory, if you want that in your ethical theory, which a lot of people do, you can kind of avoid it being very deeply subjective or culturally bound or whatever by appealing to rationality. And I think a lot of people think that even if I think morality is really subjective or culturally constructed or whatever, that maybe notions of rationality are not. That's also, there's a good question about that, right? But that's one way that people will say, well, this is still a kind of strongly objective theory, even though it's people making decisions and talking with each other and trying to come up with, here are the rules we're all going to agree to abide by, right? And the idea is supposed to be that prevents some of the most egregious stuff or the most arbitrary stuff by having rationality as a kind of thing guiding it or keeping everyone honest in a certain way. So the other thing I want to talk about now that we're kind of getting on that part of that sort of idealized theory is, one way to do this is to think about John Rawls. John Rawls was a political theorist, but his version of contract theory was actually a version of it was really influential among contemporary 20th century ethicists. A guy named T.M. Scanlon wrote a book called What We Owe Each Other that basically is like Rawls, but focused on morality instead of Rawls on political theory. And Rawls had this idea or this view called the kind of the veil of ignorance. And the idea would be, and it's a way for us to think about the social contractors. And there's a tension here, right? Because the contractors are always specific people with particular powers, and that's why they enter into the contract, right? Think about the state of nature. If I've got everything and I'm so powerful, why do I need to try to get you to agree with me? I'll just take whatever you have, right? But it's because I recognize that I'm not all powerful and other people could harm me that I want to give something up in the first place. So there's a tension between how specific the contractors have to be and what we want from them in terms of their ideal decision-making stuff, right? And the way Rawls thought to do this, and he's really thinking about how you would arrange a society, but we can think about how would I arrange moral, rules and how we treat each other, is he thought from a social perspective, veil of ignorance, basically you need to make a decision about the rules that govern society, the policies that govern society, but you don't know where you're going to end up. So you don't know your race, you don't know your sex or gender, you don't know your sexual orientation, you don't know your religious commitments, you don't know how risk averse or cautious you're going to, or risk taking you're going to be. You don't know any of these things, supposedly. You don't know if you're going to be rich or poor or anything. And why Rawls thought that was a particularly good way to think about how to arrange a society is he thought it would allow for inequality, but you would still, right, because Rawls is a contemporary kind of classical liberal. He's not necessarily a leftist or socialist or anything like that. He's also not, a libertarian or a kind of traditionally conservative person or whatever. So his view was you basically want to do that because with a veil of ignorance, you don't know where you could end up. So if I know that, for example, 50% of the people, suppose I'm thinking about this at a time where, women don't have the vote, they can't own property, they can't open a checking account without a male signature, all that kind of stuff. Well, in that case, if I don't know whether I'm going to be a man or a woman, I'm probably going to be a little hesitant about some of those rules because I could be one of the 50% of the people that get those things restricted from me, right? And so the idea would be, if we go in this veil of ignorance and try to figure out what would the best way to treat each other be, where I don't know where I'm going to end up, right? I don't know if I'm going to be, if I'm going to be subject to punishment. I don't know if I'm going to be subject to social exclusion. I don't know if the penalties for stealing are going to be severe, whatever it is, right? If I don't know where I'm going to end up, then that kind of abstracting away from my particular position is supposed to be a kind of way to guarantee that for Rawls, that the people who were the most exploited and the least, that had the least in society were at least pretty well off, because you could end up being one of those people, right? Ideally, if you're thinking about this. And so in social contract theory, that's one way to think about these moral rules is I don't know where I'm going to end up at. Like, I don't know if I'm going to be a person that has a lot of money. I don't know if I'm a person that has a lot of opportunity. I don't know if I'm going to be a person that, we're in such poor conditions that I had to scrape by and maybe do some pretty bad things to get by or whatever. I don't know, right? And so there is this tension between I want the contractors to be ideally rational and free of bias and, just make these decisions, but I also want to respect people's particularities, right? And that's supposed to be part of the appeal of social contract theory is the people come together and make the contract together. And we all figure out what we can live with, even though it's maybe not the best or what I really want or something, right? So social contract theory represents not only this clash between a really abstract conception of people and reasoning and agents versus a more particular concrete one with all of the fallible and vicious and negative things that entails, particularized, whatever. But it also represents this kind of like this blend of self-interest and morality too. Like I'm giving stuff up for my self-interest, but it's also leads me to acting better or something like that, right? I think that this also just kind of naturally leads into one of the biggest problems for social contract theory, which is, again, we've come back to it in Kantianism and utilitarianism, is the scope of the moral community, right? And in that sense, the only contractors are going to be people who have essentially something to lose, right? I mean, if I don't have something to lose, I'm not going to be contracting with you. And in fact, what Schaefer-Lando talks about is how, well, in general, in social contract theory, this basically rules out animals and plants because we don't need their permission for anything, or at least we take ourselves not to. Even if you think animals like deserve not to suffer, you still might think, just like Kant did, well, they're not able to reason, so they can't be our contractors in the sense that they can talk with us and say, hey, I will, I'm the wolf. I'll quit raiding your sheep if you leave one out once in a while, or whatever it is, right? Like they can't do that. Yeah. So they can't be contractors. And you might think of this in terms of applying to history. You might think, what reason would these really powerful people, right, these white male landowners in this time period, what reason would they have to try to be contracting with enslaved peoples or indigenous peoples? In a certain way, if they have all the power, there's no reason to engage in that contracting in the first place. And that is a real concern about contract theory is it's, in a certain way, the people who have the least power and the least means to affect others, there's a question of whether they have to be included in the moral community at all. Because usually the moral community is the contractors. That's why we're disagreeing about, or we're having to navigate the rules together, because if you don't, you're a danger to me. If I don't, I'm a danger to you, or something like that, right? Yeah. Whereas if I think you're not a danger to me, and people could be mistaken about that as, right, the revolution in Haiti shows or something like that, right? Yeah. But if I think that there's no way that you really have power to deal with me, maybe I don't have to deal with you at all. And then, just like in the context of Kant, the other thing is there's going to be a lot of people that just can't, there's going to be a lot of human beings that just can't engage in the contracting process at all, not even ideally in some way, right? Because of, their comatose status, traumatic brain injury, severe developmental disability or chromosomal condition, whatever. And so this is part of the question is, our contracts, you might expect, would be made even to cover individuals who aren't contractors. But then how that works out specifically is a really difficult issue to navigate.
Yeah, it seems like the moral dilemma is how do you make arguments to include people that are easily excluded? Yeah. And many of
because we would think morality has to cover them. In fact, it's maybe even more important than it covers them.
But many people would, especially if you have, a catalog of images attached to them. Yeah. Why would you include them if they've been demonized, or you've grown up to see them as a demonized, rightfully marginalized group?
Yeah, lesser than.
If anything, if you included them in the moral community, you would lose rights.
Sure.
Because often those rights include autonomy over them.
Yeah.
Um,
That is asymmetrical, right? It's only
yeah,
one way.
yeah. And I think, in many ways we're dealing with that today.
Sure.
Women are dealing with this, during this era too,
Sure.
where, if the 14th Amendment sort of created rights, right, for African Americans,
Yeah.
which was easily sort of thrown aside,
Yeah.
most of the civil rights legislation, besides the Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Housing
Yeah.
Rights Act of the 1960s, a lot of the Supreme Court cases rested upon the 14th Amendment.
Yeah.
So Roe v. Wade rested upon the 14th Amendment,
Yeah.
and it was easily tossed in 2022.
Yeah.
So anything that was based, this is miscegenation laws,
Yep.
or all sorts of
this
gay
is
marriage, there's all sorts of these.
The Obergefell opinion.
Yeah, and so there's these discussions open up, debate over. There's nothing written that would say that the scope of the moral community will progressively expand to include more and more people, because
that's right.
And to me, this is that different. This is like if you go back to Haitian Revolution, American Revolution.
Yeah.
The American Revolution ensures, and a part of this is the settler colonial paradigm.
Sure.
It ensures that white men, especially white men with property, are the anchor of the moral community.
Yeah.
And so the social contract is that.
Yeah.
People of African descent are naturally, right, the state of nature. Within that state of nature they're naturally excluded. Women are naturally excluded.
Yeah.
And so, for much of U.S. history, and obviously world history, but we're in the U.S., that's the debate, is
absolutely
to what extent are these marginalized groups brought in. But the other part too is, and to me, this is the this is the violence of sort of history, is there was never violence to gain these rights. So women and people of color, they were given rights. When you're given rights, those rights can be also taken away. And when we go back to, especially that turn of 1800s, the Haitian Revolution, a part of the horror of the Haitian Revolution for especially North American slave owners is you had a group of people that took their rights by violence. Right. And so the threat of the slave revolt, and also those sorts of things. So haunting that Haiti becomes isolated and marginalized for the next 150 years. But that moral community is this very culturally relative.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yes. I would at least say, like, descriptively, it is a fact, right, that like different cultures would give or restrict who's in the moral community or who has minimal moral status or whatever, based on these highly contextual and specific ideas about personhood and race and gender and other stuff. I think, I really like that Schaefer-Lando keeps bringing our attention back to that point, because I think it's really important, because I do think, like, it is, in a certain way, it's kind of there's, like, I guess there are psychological debates about this specifically, but if you think about moral development, there is something to the idea that, like, just when I'm younger, especially, like, I start by, maybe I don't even recognize my family as people I have to be nice to, right? I hit my sister, and then I have to get corrected, don't hit your sister. And then over time, I'm like, okay, I can't do that to my family because I have to give them a kind of moral status. But I don't know, who cares about this person? They ain't my family. And, so one way to think about a lot of the development of moral theory is a kind of widening or expansion of the moral scope of the community, of who has minimum moral status or what has minimum moral status. But again, there are also, so as you said, right, there's just like, there are historical factors that are at play here and cultural factors that are at play here. The other thing I think that's interesting to think about is, some of the push for example, among, the contemporary theorists who maybe don't like this too much abstraction and partiality, is to say, I actually don't think that the height of moral reasoning is to include everyone as having generally equal moral status. Like, I do have more responsibilities to my immediate family and friends than I do to strangers. Doesn't mean they don't have no moral status, but it is right for me to care more about them and to focus more on like what obligations I have to them than to some stranger.
Confucius, very.
It's a Confucian idea,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah.
It's also a kind of feminist idea, right?
Yeah.
Which is the idea of like, the social contract of these vague contractors making agreements. Well, that's one way of doing things that historically has been very male dominated. But the very female mode of interacting with people is I'm taking care of someone who depends on me, whether that's a child or an older adult relative or something like that, right? And that dependence relationship gives you kinds of moral insights that don't exist when we're all free and equally powerful and all this other stuff, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, or, there are some critiques from feminist theorists that when I abstract away all of the things, including my gender stuff, well, that isn't me anymore. Those things are constitutive to who I am, right? And so this process to make us just, sexless, genderless, ethnicity or raceless, I don't know, ideal agents that are deciding like, that's never ever the case, right? It's too abstract in a certain way because my specifics are important to me and what I think, like they've informed me in a certain way. Maybe this is kind of a standpoint theory, feminist epistemology thing, right? Like my experiences, the experiences of women at large, have given us a kind of insight into oppression that people that haven't experienced it don't have. And so that's a way for us to talk about it, right? So the specificity sometimes is there. Again, it doesn't mean that on a feminist theory, the scope of the moral community is more restricted. It's just that the kind of widening and further abstraction, there's disagreement about exactly how far that should go. And, one thing that Schaefer-Landa keeps bringing up that I think is really important is, he is talking about, not too much. He's talking about human beings that in the Kantian sense or the social contract sense maybe don't get full moral status some way, right? And that is something we mostly find really unintuitive. But he's also talking about how that affects like things like animals or nature. And those are also things that we don't always think about. Red Dead is in a certain way like this, right? Where it's like, pick as much milkweed as you want. Come back a little later, it's going to be grown back. Or kill as many animals as you want. You can sell all the horse pellet, the deer pelts, because wait a little bit, they're going to respawn, right? Yeah. And notice, of course, you don't lose any honor or anything by doing any of those things, right? So they just don't have moral status in that sense. The bison are a little bit tricky, but even there, right, they function this way in the story. But as one of the authors of one of those essays pointed out, and as you note, once you actually find the bison, you can basically kill as many as you want and keep coming back. Right? They don't in game they just respawn. So even though there's this idea of their scarcity in the actual practice of the game, it doesn't really function that way. So as we have several times, we'll end with the moral community. I hope that you're enjoying hearing us talk about this and thinking about it in relation to the game. And let's keep going forward and talking about history, ethics, and Red Dead Redemption 2. So
see you next week.
See you next time.